A special privilege to welcome Hannah Kiger. Hannah Kiger is a friend to this community, many in this community, known particularly for her ability to choose a good husband. Hannah has, I think in a lot of different ways, Hannah has always kind of been a part of Emmanuel in different ways, and so it's wonderful to welcome her today. She's currently working for Johnson City Library in marketing. She graduated from Milligan in 2006 with her degree in photography and English, and you should see some of her photographs. They're wonderful. And then in 2016, she completed her master's degree in Sustainable Peacebuilding from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And after that, after her graduation, she worked for a nonprofit where she ran Interfaith dinner dialogue programs. And that's what she'll be talking about today. In visiting with her about that, she kind of changed for me even how to put this whole series together. So I really look forward to hearing her talking about those dialogues. And we don't know exactly where all of this is possibly going to go, but we are having some conversation about maybe having her come and help us host some of those dialogues for us together to talk about some of these issues. So we welcome Hannah. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey everybody. I'm going to have to lower this mic about a foot. So last week, the Ross Smith lecturer, Ellen Ott Marshall, talked about the concept of catching the air. And I'm sure many of you were at her lecture, but for those of you who weren't, what she means by catching the air is an act of harnessing the opportunities we find in our lives where there's a possibility for transformation. The act of tapping into the movement of God as God creates a new thing. Dr. Marshall said the other night that God is always and everywhere doing a new thing. And as Christians, we affirm this, right? That God is constantly working and creating and participating in our lives, making all things new. And we're meant to, actually we're called to, get involved in this creative and generative work ourselves. That's what it means to be a Christian. Most of the time, these opportunities to catch the air, these chances to get caught up in God's creative movement, aren't flashy or big or dramatic. Often they're mundane and small, and so they get overlooked and disregarded as unimportant moments. I was particularly struck by something Dr. Marshall said in her lecture about listening, and I've been thinking about it ever since. She said that simply listening to others is an act of catching the air, just listening to them. I think I was so moved by this statement because I've experienced what she's talking about. The seemingly simple act of truly listening to someone unlocks a treasure trove of opportunities for transformation, both on a personal and a relational level. And this is the type of transformation that can't help but spill over into the wider world. When it's compounded, it can lead to positive change and growth in our communities and institutions. So like I said, I recently experienced this transformative power of simply listening to someone, and I'd like to share the story with you. I have this coworker with whom, until a few months ago, I had always had a very tenuous, rocky relationship. I'm sure you all have people in your classes and jobs that you have these kinds of relationships with. We never had outright conflict, but we didn't communicate well, and so we didn't work well together. I can't speak to how she felt about me, but I know how I felt about her. I didn't trust her, and I assumed she had the worst intentions anytime we worked together. I thought I knew her, and I didn't like what I knew. So I had decided long ago that our personalities just didn't mesh, and I avoided working with her whenever possible. That was that simple, right? But a few months ago, I ended up actually having to interview her for something I was working on. And I decided to focus my questions in a way that led her to tell stories rather than make statements. I wish I could say that I did this because I wanted to get to know her, But my real motivation was just that I wanted to get better quotes for my article. God works in mysterious ways. I used to be a journalist, and so I decided to approach the interview like I would have back then. To get a good story, journalists have to be able to walk into a situation, turn off that incessant internal monologue, and just listen without judgment. They can turn it back on when they leave, but while they're in the room, they have to not judge. What was supposed to be a 15-minute interview turned into a 2-hour conversation that we both got paid for, so that worked out well. Anyway, when I walked away from her, I couldn't believe it. All of a sudden, I didn't dislike her anymore. Actually, I really kind of wanted to be her friend. I can no longer assign bad motives or assume the worst about her, even when she does things I don't understand, which she definitely still does. But she's become one of my favorite people to work with. And recently, I was going through a really hard time, and she was a true friend to me. She checked in on me often. She gave me really thoughtful gifts. She's shown me a lot of kindness. I don't really know how to express how transformative this conversation with her was. It didn't just change our working dynamic and in the process make our organization better, although it did both those things. It also changed me personally. It really made me reevaluate how I approach people. It made me want to hold my assumptions about people at arm's length to give people the benefit of the doubt. Or, as the poet Walt Whitman says, to be curious, not judgmental. One of the other things that amazed me about the transformation this conversation brought on is that in the conversation, we never actually talked about the issues we had with each other. We never talked about why we didn't like each other or what we needed to fix. We simply talked about our lives. Now, I will say, I know from experience, and I imagine some of you are thinking, conversations in which we're trying to listen to someone we don't like don't always go this way. But I am convinced that when we go into conversations, even conversations with people we don't like, when we go into them with an open heart, with the intention to listen deeply and to try to find the image of God in them, we are never disappointed. Even if the other person doesn't approach the conversation in the same open-hearted way, we can ourselves still be transformed because we're doing the work of God. We're tapping into God's creativity. And we can hope and trust that even if they don't appreciate or reciprocate our deep listening in that moment, we can hope that our openness sticks with the other person. We can trust that God will use it to get to them eventually. That sounded kind of ominous. It sounded more ominous than I meant it to. He'll get to them. Being able to listen deeply to someone is a skill that has to be practiced and intentionally developed. When we don't exercise it, it atrophies, the same way muscles do. And when that happens, we and everyone else around us suffer for it. When I say listen deeply, I mean listening in a way that is hard for all of us. Most of the time when we think we're listening, what we're really doing is just waiting for the other person to stop talking, or thinking about what story we'll tell in response, or what we'll make for dinner, or plotting out our rebuttal to what they're saying. But this kind of listening won't ever catch the air. It doesn't lead to personal or relational transformation and growth. It doesn't catch us up in the creative work of God, because it doesn't search for God's presence in the other. That's when our relationships are transformed, when we start intentionally looking for God, or in my case with my coworker, accidentally happening upon God in the people we encounter. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk to you about my experience using listening as a way to catch the air. About 5 years ago, when Dr. Kiger, over here, you all know Dr. Kiger, when we lived in Milwaukee, I worked for a nonprofit called Interfaith Conference, and my job there was to run their dinner dialogue program, which brought people from different religions together to eat with each other and participate in structured, guided conversations in which they were able to get to know each other as humans rather than as caricatures. I'm ashamed to say that when I went to my first dinner dialogue, I was pretty skeptical. Honestly, the whole thing sounded kind of hokey to me, which wasn't great since I was going to be running the program. Not quite sure how I happened upon that job. But thankfully, I left that first dinner as a believer in the process. The simple act of eating together and listening to each other was transformative. I'll never forget watching a Baptist and a Muslim exchange phone numbers at the end of the night. That was pretty crazy. It sounds like the beginning of a joke, right? A Baptist and a Muslim exchange phone numbers. So there are different dialogue formats that have been developed over the years with different structures and goals. But the specific framework that we used at Interfaith was developed out of something called appreciative inquiry. And I don't know if y'all have heard of this, you may have, but appreciative inquiry is an approach to organizational change that identifies and focuses on what is already working and on what is possible versus zeroing in on the problem, what needs to be fixed and not seeing anything outside of that. So this appreciative inquiry approach can be used in building or reconciling interpersonal relationships as well. In the same way, dinner dialogues can be used in so many different ways, from conflict resolution between groups and individuals to simply getting to know people on a deeper level. In the dinner dialogue format that we used, people are asked and answered questions in a way that leads to listening and appreciating, rather than to agreeing or disagreeing, liking or not liking what someone says, or comparing or contrasting what's being said to one's own personal experience. The goals of these conversations are to create a safe environment for everybody participating, to encourage people to go deep in their sharing. We don't typically do that in our daily lives. To teach neutrality in interpersonal encounters, to provide the experience of being heard, and to create a learning environment. And since y'all will probably have the chance to do these dialogues over the next few months, I wanted to give you a brief introduction to how they work and also why they work. So basically, participants eat together, and throughout the course of the meal, each person draws a card with a question on it. You read the question aloud, then you have about 30 seconds to think about your answer. Then you get 5 minutes uninterrupted to answer the question. While you're speaking, no one else in the group can interrupt or ask questions. Once you've finished, no one comments or asks follow-up questions. Then the next person draws a card, and the process begins again. The structure of no interruptions and no commentary can be kind of disconcerting at first. We're so used to getting positive or negative cues and feedback from people when we talk, that to be met with neutrality and with that silence it can be scary at first. But the no interruptions or commentary rule is vital to the dialogue process. It minimizes our very human tendency to listen only in order to respond with our own story or belief or opinion. So that internal monologue we have that never seems to shut up, we all have that, I think. If you don't have that, you're super lucky. Even when someone is talking to us, that internal voice can kind of go quiet for a while. You share when it's your turn, and then you get to listen the rest of the time to simply hear what others are saying without pressure or distraction. It's actually very freeing once you kind of start to feel more comfortable with it. No two people answer the same question, and no one gets their question ahead of time. Both of these elements are also essential to the exercise. For one thing, that pressure you feel to say the right thing or to be more interesting or insightful than another person, that's all gone, because you'll be the only person who gets to answer your particular question. Also, since you don't get the question beforehand, you can't spend the whole dinner thinking about how you'll answer it, which is exactly what I would do. The questions themselves are also really important. The questions don't seek facts and opinions so much as stories and examples from our lives. In this setting, with these questions, we find a space that is so rare these days, a place where we can turn off with the sociologist Arlie, I can never say her name, Hochschild, what she calls our alarm systems. All those little alarm bells that go off when someone starts saying something that we don't agree with. And while people will inevitably bring their beliefs or opinions in the course of answering their questions, the questions are framed in such a way that you get to the belief through the story. So you get more context for where a person is coming from. So some sample questions for us might be, when has forgiveness in a relationship impacted your life? Was it your forgiveness of another person or vice versa? How did the experience of forgiveness affect you? Or for instance, reflect on a time when you found it difficult to connect to God. What was the circumstance? How did you break through? Or another one could be, have you ever been discriminated against because of your beliefs or who you are? Or do you know someone who has? Describe what happened and how you reacted. Or when in your life has your spiritual community or some other form of community been the key to getting you through a difficult time in your life? What did the community provide and how did that affect you? So those are just a couple sample questions that you might answer if you come to dialogues. So to conclude, I believe that as Christians, we always and everywhere have the opportunity to participate in God's creative work. And this work happens in the small and the mundane, in the interactions and moments that we don't think mean anything. When we do something as simple as deeply listening to each other, when we seek out God's presence in one another in that way, we can't help but get caught up in the constant work of God in the world.